Well, we have Dylan Ratigan here with Corona Money Talk. Let's bring him right in. You know him; he's an award-winning reporter, and he's a best-selling New York Times author. He's the host of Truth or What is it? I always forget. What is the name of your podcast, Dylan?
Truth or Skepticism.
That's right. Truth or Skepticism with Tom Sosnoff at Tasty Trade. He's here with us right now. The one, the only Dylan Ratigan with Corona Money Talk. Hi, Dylan. How are you?
James, it's always a pleasure. It's always a pleasure. Nice to be talking to you.
So now, when they passed the CARES Act, the first the third stimulus bill, the big one, that was the $5 trillion upward transfer of wealth, and immediately after they passed that, without giving a UBI to workers or people, or without giving Medicare for all, health care to people inside of a pandemic, or canceling debt, or canceling rent, or canceling more, without doing any of that, you immediately had predicted that there would be social unrest. And so what I've been telling people, and what we're going to talk about, is the Democrats' lack of response to what's happening right now. That if Nancy Pelosi, instead of releasing another insult tirade at Donald Trump, would draft legislation to give $2,000 to every human being in the country every month, and give everybody health care, student loan relief, and free education, you wouldn't see these riots right now. That's my position. What do you think, Dylan?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that we have been on a tragic path that has been recklessly and arrogantly sort of waddled down by the political class. And, you know, when the pandemic came, it was like taking the safety off of a gun. And instead of putting the safety back on immediately, meaning job preservation, meaning UBI, meaning Medicare for all, there's a larger issue, unfortunately, which just has to do with the structural degradation of humanity as a base condition, really, on the planet and certainly in the society. And I think because there is that sort of psychic degradation that is at the foundation of whether it's the decisions inside of how policies are made, or whether it's in the way the airline treats you when you buy a plane ticket, or whether it's in the way that social services treats a family, or whether, there's so many expressions of that degraded violence in our culture, that the extension of that degradation into the pandemic had a level of arrogance, I think, or I don't know. I won't even conjure to try to understand what's inside of it. But anyway, we talked, there's a biological crisis, an economic crisis, a social crisis, a financial crisis, and then ultimately a military crisis. We have obviously a biological crisis. We have obviously an economic crisis. Chairman Powell, who you talked about last week, really has avoided a financial crisis. And for people to understand that, the economic crisis is, I can't eat, I can't pay my rent, I can't move my car, I can't pay the rent on this small business, I can't pay the rent on this big business. That's an economic crisis. A financial crisis is there's not enough money in the system because there's too many defaults, and now nobody can get any money, even if they're not in default, which is sort of an echo of the economic crisis can provoke a financial crisis. Anyway, that right now is not a risk. It's not a thing. As Powell said, that he can do as much as he wants. And obviously the social crisis has become, and rightly so, has taken center stage, and the most tragic path possible, really.
Now, when you said that, when you predicted, very presciently predicted that there would be social crisis, and so the straw that broke the camel's back was the killing in Minneapolis.
Of course.
But the tinder was the economic devastation that Americans have felt since almost my whole lifetime. So certainly since Ronald Reagan, and the lack of a rational response to it from the left. There has been no rational response to our economic devastation of our middle class and working poor. And what they've done is doubled down.
Joe Biden made his political career putting black men in jail.
Right.
And so Kamala Harris.
Right. So now when we have this guy like when we have a guy like Donald Trump, the answer to Donald Trump that the left offers or the opposition party offers is another Trump with a nicer demeanor. That's it. And Joe Biden has no ideas how to fix this crisis. He has no ideas how it got here. He has no idea how we got Trump, even though he's directly responsible for Trump. The 8 years he spent in the White House, and of course the time he spent in the Senate writing things like the crime bill and deregulating Wall Street and screwing people in bankruptcies. Joe Biden has set the table for this to happen. And so when you predicted social unrest, I didn't have any idea it would be like this. And I'll just give you one little itty bitty example. Here's a woman walking up to a cop asking her what's going to happen when the curfew kicks in at 8 o'clock. And let's hear his response.
Can I ask you what's going to happen at 8? Sir?
What's going to happen is they're going to start beating the fuck out of you.
And I don't know if you heard what he said. She asked him what's going to happen at 8 o'clock, and he said, "What's going to happen is we're going to start beating the fuck out of you."
Yeah, I saw that. I saw that clip a few hours ago. Somebody showed me that. Yeah.
So I don't have to really show you another video, but I will. Here's the video of them actually doing that. Here they go. Now, is that the Taliban in my country? Is that Al Qaeda? Is that Al Qaeda in my country? Is that ISIS? Because I couldn't imagine anybody acting more violently, more perverted in enforcing law in the world. I can't imagine it. It's happening right here. So we've said at this show, since I've started this show, whatever we do to people overseas, we will eventually do to ourselves. And we're doing it right now. So this is, not only did the oligarchs come in and rape the country of our natural resources and take $5 trillion right out of your pocket and give it to the richest 1,000 motherfuckers, but they also didn't give you health care, and they also closed down your business, and they also didn't give you help with your rent or your mortgage or anything. It is an unbelievable ass-kicking that American citizens are taking from this rapacious oligarchy right now. And the police are as bad as anything I've ever seen, from Nazi Germany to what you name it. Where I can't think of a place. The cops are now the Gestapo. They are now the SS, and they are brutalizing America. You know what I don't see video of, Dylan, is I've never seen a video of cops brutalizing looters. It seems like the cops want people to loot so they can go crack the heads of peaceful protesters more. Have you seen a video of them cracking heads of looters? I've only seen police killing, cracking heads, and beating up and brutalizing peaceful protesters.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the distinction you're making, and it's obviously a very clear one. I haven't seen that. I think I've been trying to take a slightly different, perspective, I guess, in that, not that there is any untruth or in anything that people are seeing. Obviously, the police forces are, exhibiting and have been exhibiting, murderous violence, both as a culture, as a system, et cetera, et cetera. Also, there are plenty of good cops, right? At the same time, there are these huge and beautiful protests for justice, and there are also maniac assholes who are taking advantage of the situation to rob the Apple store. Now, I think that the bigger issue, for me anyway, this is for me personally, it's easy for me to get drawn into whatever the narrative of that primal rage is. But what is apparent to me is that the imperative, remember the Hong Kong protests, whether you like them or not, they had a very specific set of requests. They wanted a thing or a series of things, not just to be in resistance to everything or even something, but sought to secure a specific thing. And when you look at the karmic consequences of the injustice that is at afoot here, Obviously, on a racial level, with the black community in America going back to slavery. Obviously, on an economic level, really going back to the founding of the country. And the obvious shortcoming, it sounds trite, the shortcoming relative to the idea or the aspiration of the sort of mythology or the mythology of this country and the gap, and obviously that issue. But I think that the only path right now is the faster people can coalesce around demanding the end of qualified immunity for the police, so that there's not a sense of total invulnerability or supremacy from police relative to any murder or wrongdoing. The immediate release of all nonviolent drug offenders in the American prison system. There are some very obvious structural oppressions that exist right now, whether it's on the protections and leverage with the police unions, or whether it is in the incarceration of the nonviolent minority community in this country that are obvious. And there's a huge opportunity to recognize and harness the power of that solution to release murderous, violent energy at its most primal and sort of like the black tar of the soul of the earth, which is what's running through all this. Its only redeeming quality is the incredible momentum it creates for and velocity for structural change. Unfortunately, that velocity can and frequently goes towards more violence and more tragedy and more murder. However, there is the possibility that some of that, or all of that, or more of that, can be harvested for something that has value, so that, all of the damage, psychic, physical, emotional, and loss of life, can be a catalyst for some permanent structural change, which obviously I'm somewhat cautious and somewhat pessimistic for, because obviously when it gets to this point, the only reason it gets to the point that it's got to is because of a refusal to do that exact thing. But, the kinetic energy is loose, and there's a lot there going back, whether you want to go back 40 years, whether you want to go back to the 1960s, whether you want to go back to the 1980s, whether you want to go back to the financial crisis, or you want to go back last week to George Floyd. It's not right. It simply is not right. And everybody, listen, you can talk about it 1,000 ways and yell and scream and all these things. The energy must be focused on immediate structural reform, with incarceration of nonviolent offenders and qualified immunity in the police at the top of the list. And any leader worth a damn who actually wants to help this country and these people and any person, instead of simply stoking the blame of the atrocity that it's there. The police are too violent. The police are brutally agitating. There are all these looting vectors from the left, from the right, anarchists, etc. There is this huge surge of peaceful protests. There are people, you can live the woman who's the police chief in Atlanta has been, done some fabulous things. There's lots of, I can tell whatever story I want to tell, but they're all just stories, and it's not that they lack truth or merit. It's that none of them move closer to the solution, which must bear itself out immediately in reform on incarceration and in reform on qualified immunity, which are at the centerpiece of this, and really then tie back to basic economic oppression and the lack of availability of basic resources like healthcare. So, we've kind of moved from UBI and Medicare for all to this really acute and unresolved issue having to do with qualified immunity and the prison industrial complex as it relates to nonviolent, frequently either marijuana or other drug offenders or parole violations associated with prior nonviolent drug offenses or bail issues associated with nonviolent drug offenses. And the compounding factor of all those things has replaced going to college in huge sections of urban neighborhoods in this country at a huge social cost and a huge economic cost. We can debate whether my particular points on prison reform and qualified immunity are the right answer, but I'll tell you this: we need to get a handle right now on what we're going to do with this energy, because if we do not get a handle on what to do with this energy, we're not able to find grace in the tragedy. It will continue to consume this country.
So what you're referring to is this is another protest. We had 700,000 people in the streets in Los Angeles in January of 2017 to protest Trump's election, but it didn't have a point. There was no demand. And so what you're saying is, again, just like with Occupy Wall Street, they didn't have a demand. And so we need to have a demand. And so what I've been telling people is we need to have 3 demands. We need to have UBI immediately, Medicare for all, and we need to have a promise, just like you said. I was saying demilitarize the police and turn it over to the communities, but you have even more specific. So you're talking about getting rid of qualified immunity, which is where cops get special protection in order to murder you. And so tell people what qualified immunity is.
I mean, I'm not even an expert myself, so I don't want to speak too far outside of my domain knowledge. But my understanding from what I've only recently been trying to understand what can be done and what, I'm a student as much as I am a teacher on this one, Jimmy, but my sense is that the threshold for liability for a police officer in the line of duty is strongly in their favor relative to the loss of, if they kill somebody while they're working in a way that no other job has. I think that's understandable, understanding the job. I think it's also ripe and obviously a huge opportunity for abuse and needs to be rebalanced. I think that we do ourselves a disservice to make the police the villain as much as anybody else. The police do themselves a disservice with their behavior. And so I'm not moralizing when I offer this. I'm really more pressing again for something that some semblance of grace because we already have obviously a number of people who have died, not the least of which being George Floyd, and back that list of mostly black men whose names we'll never even know. That the value in that that must be seized at this moment, lest everything be lost.
I'm with you. The problem with getting a demand met for prison reform is that the corporations are going to push back really hard. And of course, we've seen that we have no representation in our government, federally anyway. We have nobody standing up for us on the federal level. I mean, absolutely nobody, because they just set in motion for this to happen. Every Democrat, every progressive that's elected federally in Washington, D.C. helped make this happen, including Bernie Sanders. When they passed that CARES Act, that screwed everybody. Instead of using their leverage at that moment to make sure the people were taken care of first, so they didn't have this kind of anxiety and that it didn't explode like it's exploding right now. And so I'm making a direct connection to the CARES Act and the failure of Bernie Sanders and every progressive in Congress to this. And they still have no answers. They have zero answers. Okay, so that's the problem is so they work for the corporation. So the corporation wants the slave labor they get from the prison industrial complex, plus the people who make billions of dollars a year off private prisons. They own those legislators, and they're never, ever going to legislate something that takes money away from those people. They're never going to stop slave labor. Kamala Harris, when she was the attorney general here in California, was ordered twice by a judge to release prisoners, and she wouldn't. Her office argued in court in front of a judge that they wouldn't release prisoners as ordered twice by a judge because it would mess up their prison labor system. So that's the donor class telling Kamala Harris, don't you dare screw up our prison labor, which is really slave labor. And who does she follow? She follows the donors. Now she's a senator. Now she might be the vice presidential candidate. They still feel the exact same way. So that's our big problem is we have no one working for us inside government whatsoever. And we are in a complete oligarch. We have no democracy. So there's no way to vote our way out of this. And the only way to get out of this is direct action. And the problem is there's no leaders of this direct action. There's not even Al Sharpton isn't even out there. He's so bought, he won't even show his face. Like where's Jesse Jackson? Where's Al Sharpton? There is no lead. Where's Barack Obama? Where is Barack Obama? Where's Michelle Obama? Where is Colin Powell? Where are the leaders in America? They are fucking nowhere. Where are the Democratic leaders? They are nowhere. All they can do is wag their finger at the village idiot. That's all they're doing once again. Hey, this is the part where I tell you where our live shows are, but there aren't any. And then I would tell you to go join our premium, but nobody has a fucking job. So why don't you just enjoy the video?